Hello, I'm Anand, Naidoo, and welcome to The Heat. I'm joining you via Zoom from my home just outside of Washington, D.C. With COVID-19 changing the way that we broadcast, this is the new reality that we face. Both China and the United States are beginning to slowly reopen while continuing to deal with the devastating impact of the virus. We'll talk about those challenges ahead with our panel. But we begin with some promising news of a potential treatment for COVID-19. We're joined now by Dr. Michael Saag. He is the Dean for Global Health at the University of Alabama. He joins us via Zoom from Birmingham. Dr. Saag, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A vaccine for COVID-19 is still about 18 months away, so I guess this makes a treatment imperative. We're hearing of a drug called Remdesivir, which has shown some promise. In fact, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health says it works in certain instances. What can you tell us about this drug?
Well, the drug was originally developed back in around 2014, 2015 as a potential treatment for Ebola. Didn't work too well against that disease, but in the process of working it up, it was tested against the prior SARS virus and a virus that caused MERS. They're both coronaviruses and seemed to have activity. They took the drug and then put it into patient populations starting just about 6 or 7 weeks ago. And the study rapidly accrued, got 1,000+ patients in it. And what it did, it compared treatment with remdesivir against a placebo. And that's critical because just treating patients and seeing outcomes without a comparator group doesn't really tell the story. So this was a first study that was well done and had a comparator group.
So this treatment would take away the symptoms. Would it actually remove the virus?
The drug is an antiviral, so it's actually a derivative of an HIV drug called tenofovir, although it's not tenofovir, and it attacks one of the enzyme systems within the virus. So it shuts down viral replication, and that's how the drug works. And by doing that, it gives a leg up to the immune system to help clear the virus in a more efficient way.
Now, President Trump has not extended those stay-at-home guidelines. They expired on Thursday. The president says he's now leaving it up to the states. In fact, you wrote a piece in which you said ending restrictions without plans based on sound public health principles will almost surely result in a new wave of viruses. Tell us what's not being done and what needs to be done.
So let's look at this just kind of from a common sense perspective. We have a virus that's very contagious. It's in our midst. We have a group of people, the majority of whom don't have any immunity to this. So what we did when we put the stay-at-home restrictions is we put kind of a firewall between these two areas, and it's worked. We haven't eliminated transmission, but we dampened it down, the so-called flattening of the curve, and that gave us some time to breathe. If suddenly we pull that firewall away and allow the virus in the population to reconnect, what do we expect is going to happen? We're going to see the surge of cases once again as if we're back at the beginning of March in the United States. So what do we need to do? We need to use the time that we have, that we've gained through the social restrictions, to implement policies as we ease the restrictions to increase the immediate time case contact tracing. That's something that's been done in infectious diseases forever. We use it a lot in tuberculosis, for example, and it works. So what that means is we find a case from symptoms, immediately test them, confirm they have the infection, and then very rapidly find all of their contacts who they've been in close contact with, isolate them for the time period, test them immediately. Those who are positive, we continue the isolation and we find their contacts. And for those who are negative, we can release them, but with some observation. That is what we need to do. Unfortunately, most states and most communities that are releasing restrictions don't have that kind of safe approach in place. And I'm very worried that we're going to get another surge in cases.
From what you're telling us here, it would look like this would require a huge number of people to go out into the field and track people.
It's going to require, based on recent estimates just in the last few days, about 100,000 case contact workers across the country. That's a lot of people. On the other hand, we have a lot of people who are finding themselves unemployed right now. And so assuming we can find a way to mobilize the workforce and put them at work in this direction, I think could be a win-win.
Dr. Saag, you contracted the virus yourself. In fact, you wrote about it in the Washington Post. I read that report. It's a harrowing report. How did you first realize that you had the virus? What were the circumstances?
So my son and I were traveling back from New York City in the first part of March in a car ride together for 20 hours. On the second day of travel, he started not feeling well, and we suspected he might have coronavirus. So when we got to Birmingham and we're unpacking the car, he said, "I think I have a fever," and he did. So we immediately quarantined ourselves. The next day, I started developing symptoms. The harrowing part of this was not the first 5 days, but on day 6 at night, I would get very sick, fever, headache, muscle aches, having what I call fuzzy thinking or a little bit of confusion. And the problem with this, as a physician in particular, is that I knew that if my breath got short, if I was going to have trouble breathing, I knew exactly what I was facing in terms of the hospital, possibly the ICU, possibly a ventilator, and possibly death. So every night, these symptoms would return, and in the morning, they'd go away. So every night, I was consumed with nightmarish thoughts about what's going to happen next, and it was horrible.
Your son recovered a lot sooner than you did.
He did. He was sick for about 4 or 5 days and then recovered completely. And for me, after 5 days that morning, I felt great. I thought, okay, I'm going to be like him. That night, fever for 8 nights in a row. It was like Groundhog Day. It kept coming back and again and again.
Dr. Saag, you used a treatment on yourself, which is pretty controversial. You took hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. And as I say, the president supports this, but a lot of people don't. But did it work for you?
I can't tell that it did. In retrospect, I'm a little bit embarrassed, for lack of a better word, that I jumped on this without any data. What we did know at the time, and this is mid-March, that combination in France and among 20 people, just 20 people, actually showed that the amount of virus was reduced compared to those who didn't have it. So I thought in those desperate moments, and you've just heard them described, where I was worried that the next night I was going to end up on a ventilator, I said, well, what do I have to lose? Let's try it. I didn't feel like it did anything to help me. It didn't hurt me. But as I read a little more about this, I realized that those two drugs given together can cause fatal heart rhythms that could cause sudden death. I think what it does point out is the desperation that patients and providers feel as they're taking care of patients. And that desperation I saw in full force when I took care of AIDS patients back in the 80s when we had nothing to offer, and all types of remedies were tried without much success. So I get it now. I've experienced that, and I think it's helped me as a provider.
When you were describing your symptoms just now, you said at one stage you felt a little bit fuzzy. Was that an impact, or did it affect your cognitive ability? Did it have some kind of neurological impact?
Yes, and what I think we're finding is that the virus induces an immune response, and it's probably that immune response that is affecting multiple organ systems, including the brain. The loss of smell that I experienced, about half the people with this disease lose their sense of smell. That's a neurologic complication. The lung we know about. It also can involve the heart and cause inflammation of the heart that makes the heart not pump efficiently anymore. It's called a cardiomyopathy. It can affect the kidneys. A lot of people get renal failure and so forth. So that's the horror of this disease, is somebody gets it and we have no idea at the outset which path that person's going to go down. And it's kind of hold your breath and wait for the roller coaster ride to be over.
So it took about 2 weeks for you to recover. How did it end?
It just sort of went away. And I wasn't sure. So you got the story of every night. Mornings I'd feel okay. So I woke up that particular morning feeling well, like I had some of the previous mornings, but that morning felt a little bit different. I could sort of sense that it was going away, but I was really anxious to see how I was going to do that night. And fortunately, none of the symptoms came back, and I've been symptom-free more or less since then.
The World Health Organization says that there is no evidence that people who've recovered from coronavirus have antibodies protecting them from a second infection. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we do have antibodies. I participated in a research study from day one, or day 3 technically, of my infection. I work at a university that does a lot of research, and I had a lot of vials of blood drawn, and then every 2 weeks after that. It turns out that my antibody level is very high. And not only that, it actually neutralizes the virus, which means when you put the antibody in tissue culture with the virus, it protects the cells from becoming infected. So we know that antibody is produced. We know that it can neutralize. The question that the WHO is getting to, okay, great, but does that protect me or other people like me from getting infected again should I come into contact with the virus? That question remains unknown. I'm certainly hopeful that it does, but I don't have a guarantee of that right now.
You know, there are so many people who are so eager to get back to their normal lives, if one could put it that way. But the WHO says that the worst is still to come. And in fact, Dr. Anthony Fauci himself says that a second round of the coronavirus is, in his words, inevitable.
Yeah, and I've heard that and I agree with it, but my concern is even broader. I'm not sure the first round is going to necessarily go away for a second round to hit. So what I'm seeing, especially as we talked about earlier, if we are not smart about how we re-engage and how we lift these restrictions, we're going to have a roar of infection over the summer and into the fall. And the reason that's particularly concerning, besides the death that's going to continue if we don't act smart in terms of releasing restrictions, is that by the time the fall and the winter come around, we not only would have coronavirus, we'll have influenza as well. And then we'll be forced to distinguish between the two.
Dr. Michael Saag, we wish you well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there is still much to talk about. We'll be joined by our panel next. You're watching The Heat.
CGTN, covering coronavirus. From Asia, Africa, Europe, and America. The dangers, the uncertainty, a global effort to stop the spread and save lives. For the latest updates on coronavirus, stay with CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing challenges from COVID-19. Let's get to our panel. Victor Gao is in Beijing. He's Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Joseph Williams joins us from Washington, D.C. He's the Senior News Editor at U.S. News and World Report. And from Virginia, Arthur Dong is a professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Arthur, let me start with you. Looking at the situation here in the United States, the economic situation that is, jobless claims are now 30 million, and the economy has seen its sharpest drop in a very long time. It's dropped 4.8% in the first quarter, and the Federal Reserve is warning that the second quarter could be even worse. Question is, how does the United States get out of this, and how long is it going to take?
Yeah, that's the big question that everybody's contemplating right now. Yes, however grim the numbers are, and certainly the first quarter results are pretty grim indeed, and it is expected that the second quarter results are going to be 30% worse. So given this set of circumstances, the big question now that's confronting governments in the United States is how are we going to get out of this? And once the lockdowns start to dissipate, what is the U.S. economy going to look like on the other side of this? One thing that I think that's pretty much well agreed upon is that this will not be a V-shaped recovery, more like either a U-shape or an L-shape. Now, in terms of the numbers, how they stand, they are not unexpected, because this is what you're going to see when you have an economy in hibernation. In other words, the economy has been put on a sort of in a comatose state intentionally. So what generally is going to happen is once we restore some degree of normalcy and release this sort of lockdown phase, there is an expectation that the United States economy is going to begin the slow recovery process. Now, it's not going to be like a light switch on off. It'll be more like a dimmer, slowly dialing it back into place. And one of the things I think that's distinctively different from this crisis versus, let's say, the Great Depression is that this is not a structural, there is not a structural defect in the United States economy. This is a medically induced coma, which means once the coma is lifted and the patient is revived, that we will be restored to normalcy. Now, I say one more thing relating to the differences between this current state and the Depression. The Depression, 30% of employment in the United States was farm-based employment during the Great Depression. What sparked one of the elements that's led to the sort of longevity of the Great Depression was the fact that a lot of farmers were thrown off the farm as a result of increasing productivity on the farm. That is not the circumstance today. Farm employment is a very small portion of our overall economy, and this is basically a service-based economy, meaning that those structural differences that weren't addressed in the Great Depression were finally addressed with the start of World War II, meaning good industrial policy and putting all those unemployed farmers to work in war production and war factories. We have a different set of circumstances today, which leads me to believe that the recovery will be more intact and perhaps more robust than many of the naysayers are describing.
All right, let's go to Victor in Beijing. And Victor, China is also hurting economically. In fact, one of the key indexes in the country, which is the Caixin Market Index, which tracks export orders, has been dropping at a really fast rate. In fact, it's the fastest rate in decrease in the number of orders since the 2008 financial crisis. What is your assessment of the damage this could cause China?
Of course, the economic damage, economic toll taken on the Chinese economy cannot be bad as we originally thought. It's much worse than originally expected. The Chinese economy in the first quarter contracted by 6.8%. That has never happened for 41 years. This is the first quarterly retraction, that is the shrinkage of the Chinese economy, and by a very large percentage point, 6.8%. While the Chinese government still believes that by the end of the year, the originally set economic growth target for China for this year could be more or less achieved. That's around 6% GDP growth. I think more and more scholars tend to believe that probably if we can achieve half of that target number, that is 3% for the whole year of 2020, that will be indeed a very good number. And the impact of the coronavirus 19 on different sectors of the Chinese economy is very, very different. You have very different impact from one sector to another. Actually, the crisis, ironically, has served as a booster and catalyst for some of the sectors, like 5G, like greater connectivity, like many new paradigms, like distant learning, distant diagnosing by doctors, etc. And this will be the new normal. I think Chinese economy will be more connected virtually by digitalization, and there will always be a level of alertness and awareness about any possibility of rebounds of the coronavirus to haunt us. So I would say the Chinese economy as well as Chinese society in general will need to develop a two-mode paradigm, a normal mode, which we very much hope for, and an emergency mode, which either different places, different sectors, different industries need to move into as quickly as possible once there is any reoccurrence of the virus attack.
Joseph, President Trump says that the very vaunted trade deal with China, the first phase or phase one of that trade deal, is not his priority right now. It's another coronavirus casualty. He says, the president says that that deal has been damaged by the economic fallout from this pandemic. What do you make of it?
I think he's right. I mean, part of the issue that we're having here is that we have such contentious relationships with China that his rhetoric really isn't helping all that much. And simply because of that, I mean, if we set aside the coronavirus alone, that could do a lot of great damage to any kind of potential deal he might have had with the Chinese government to restore trade ties and normalize relations. But there are two things that come to mind when you ask the question about how we recover from this. The first is that taking the analogy, torturing the analogy a little further about the economy being in a medically induced coma, yeah, that is absolutely correct. But one of the problems that we have is before the coma took into effect, we had certain aspects of the American economy that were atrophied, right? That were not really performing up to standard, and the economy had adjusted in such a way that will make it a little bit more difficult to recover from a deep recession such as this one. We don't manufacture nearly as much as we used to. One of the ways we got out of the Great Depression in the 30s was the World War II economy started cranking up, especially once the United States entered there. We had social programs that got people back to work, building infrastructure, building things. We don't do that to the degree that we did back then. We don't do that now. Secondly, we're a service-based economy, and that is a big issue because the services that we provide require workers to be safe. I'm talking about grocery stores, I'm talking about restaurants, I'm talking about delivery services, tech companies. Those are the things that the United States does really, really well, but they are also a lot more collaborative than manufacturing a pipeline or putting a reservoir to create energy. So that is going to be a difficulty, especially in such polarized times. So when we do come out of this economy, we're going to have more aspects of it that were atrophied from the coma, that were even rough shape before the coma, that we're going to have to correct. And among them is pivoting towards manufacturing and pivoting away from service.
Arthur, the Eurozone economies have also contracted 4% in the first quarter. That's the worst it has seen since 1949. We look at Germany. Some businesses there have reopened, but it's going into a recession, and it's going to be the worst recession since since World War II. How long can the global economy sustain these kinds of losses?
Well, I think it's going to require a global coordinated effort on the part of all the major economies around the world, certainly with the EU, certainly with China, and certainly with the United States. In order to sort of restart these economies, we're going to not only have to address domestic issues in a way that Joseph has just described, meaning good policy, thoughtful policy, bipartisan policy, in order to address this big question of the demand side. Supply side around the world is coming back to order. We see factories opening up in China. In Germany, the automotive factories are opened up again. And so the supply side is starting to trickle back. The big question right now, globally, is how are we going to address demand? And right now, demand has been gutted. And so that is going to require focused effort on the part of all governments, including governments in the EU.
Victor, I want to look at some of the politics of this. When this crisis broke out, President Trump was praising President Xi Jinping of China. He was praising the World Health Organization for its response to the pandemic. But if we look at what's happened recently, he's blaming China almost on a daily basis for this pandemic. In fact, the criticisms gets shriller by the day, if you look at it. He also has been citing news reports which say that his intelligence services have been asked to find some kind of link between the outbreak of this pandemic and the Wuhan virology laboratory. In fact, the intelligence services have already said that they have not found a link, but he is asking them again to find this link. What do you make of it?
I would say to politicize intelligence and to presidentialize intelligence is the worst that the American people can get. And it will hurt the fundamental interest of the American people, of the United States, as well as world peace and development as a whole. And in the middle of this global fight against coronavirus, this is really the worst you can expect from the president of the United States. I'm afraid President Donald Trump wants to do whatever he can to try to save his presidential election. He doesn't care much about the American people or the fundamental interest of the United States as a government, as a country. And I feel very sorry for that, because blaming China doesn't help the United States fight against the coronavirus. The coronavirus is the common enemy of China, as well as the United States, as well as mankind as a whole. We need to be in the same ship and same boat to fight the common war against coronavirus. And in this respect, China and the United States can really work together rather than being opposed to each other. China has shipped, according to the Chinese ambassador in Washington, Ambassador Cui, about 1.8 billion protective masks to the United States over the past several weeks, and also all kinds of PPEs, ventilators, and gears, gowns, gloves, etc., even body bags, for example, are made in China and shipped to the United States. I want to see more Chinese cooperation with the United States in helping saving lives in the United States, rather than politics getting into the way and warmongers, for example, in the United States, really flaring up more and more indignified approach to confrontation between the two great countries.
Joseph, one of the more alarming developments that is pretty reminiscent of the build-up to the Iraq war here is that the president is calling on his intelligence services to find him the information to basically buttress his political views on this. And I'm wondering if the United States could fall into a trap of its own making here.
It's hard to see how that trap gets avoided, especially when you have the leader of the country, and some would argue the leader of the free world, trying to manufacture evidence in plain view almost that he is not responsible for what has happened and the devastation that has happened in the United States. Now, look, it's wholly unbecoming of me to try to suggest his motives, and I can't get inside of his head. And I do, at some level, believe that he does care about the American people, but he seems to care about his election prospects a little bit more. And that is part of the issue that we're having here, where you have thousands of people dying in the United States by the day, yet a lot of pressure to reopen the economy, which was going to be one of his signature issues heading into the fall. And this also dovetails with what I was saying a little bit earlier, in the fact that, yes, we did receive hundreds of pounds of shipments from China to help the United States cope with this virus. And we don't manufacture half of the prescriptions that we need in order to combat it. So cooperation with China is vital, and I don't think it does any good to call names and to try to manufacture something out of whole cloth that everyone, most of his own experts, have agreed simply isn't there. So it's unhelpful. I don't know how he gets out of this. I do know that, having gone through the Iraq War experience, a lot of journalists are paying attention, a lot of the American public is paying attention, and it's hard to imagine that we would get fooled on that level again.
Arthur, very quickly, we've just got a few seconds left. Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health has warned of a second wave of the coronavirus. I'm wondering how much kind of damage that could do to the economy, and does that push back recovery even further?
It does push back recovery further, but here's a question of preparation. You've got to have dedicated, focused effort on the part of the executive branch, as well as all branches of government at the federal and local level, to sort of stave this off. When your medical professionals are telling you that another wave is coming, you prepare for it. You can't prevent a storm, but you can reduce the impact of the storm with adequate preparation.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidoo, broadcasting from just outside my home in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.